Today's speaker series is going to be So You Want to Become a CEO. Um, and with that, we have Kim Roberts Hedgepeth today speaking with us. She is the CEO of the Film Musician Secondary Markets Fund, which was a nonprofit that collects and distributes residuals to musicians who work in films and TV programs. From the years of 2005 to 2012, she served as the National Executive Director of the American Federation of Television and Radio Arts, which goes by AFTRA, if I pronounce it correctly. During
Correct.
her 31-year association with AFTRA, she led negotiations in all areas of entertainment, news, and sound recordings. Her board members have included Sound Exchange, the Fed's 12th District Economic Advisory Council, and was the past chair and current board member of Film LA Incorporations. So, just an overview of what exactly a CEO is. It stands for a Chief Executive Officer, but they are essentially the highest ranking executive in a company whose primary responsibilities include making the major corporate decisions, managing the overall operations and resources of a company, and acting as the main point of communications between the board and being the public face of the company. So they are elected by the board members and its shareholders, and a CEO usually is synonymous with an executive director, a president, or a chairperson, depending on the type of corporation or organization, um, just depending on the type that it is. Um, so I got this directly from the website of the film, excuse me, of the Film Musician Secondary Markets Fund. So there, and it's where Kim is the CEO of, but their mission statement goes by, it acts as a unique resource to research, collects and distributes musicians' residual payments for the exploitation of their talents in the motion picture, television, and digital media industries. Our commitment to accuracy, integrity, education, and excellence in serving musicians, producers, and the entertainment industry worldwide provides leadership that promotes the interests of the motion picture, television, and digital media industries and the professionals they employ. So I wanted to include this just to give a little bit more background of the nonprofit organization so it could help guide our questions once we get to that. And pathways to becoming a CEO, it of course varies per individual. But Kim's story basically, she got her bachelor's degree and a BA, which is a bachelor's of arts from Harvard University. Then went on to graduate school and got her Juris Doctorate or her JD from Georgetown. And then I will pass the rest on to her to talk about her experiences and her journey in becoming a CEO and where she is today.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Rosie. And thank you, everybody, for joining today. And I want to thank the parents, educators, teachers, and students in action, as well as the Los Angeles Teen Court program and the community outreach division of the program. So thank you all. I think I'm going to probably get a lot more out of this when we have an opportunity to have Q&A and have a little bit of a discussion. I want to thank Rosie for reading my bio so that you have a little bit of sort of the specifics, but any resume might be able to tell you where you've been, but it doesn't necessarily explain what it took to get there and what the lessons are that you learn along the way. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of the steps that got me to a position where I'm the CEO. The term our organization uses is executive director, but we'll use the term CEO because it's essentially the same. Got me to this point. I have to say that when I was a graduating senior from a New York City public high school, I never imagined that I would one day be the executive director of a nonprofit performing the role of a CEO. And that includes, as was indicated, managing budgets, hiring teams, leading those teams, elevating those teams, dealing with the press and other organizations, managing a relationship with your board of directors, and very key for a CEO role is to be able to develop strategic plans that ensures that your business or your organization is prepared for the economic and business environment that is going to exist in 5 or 10 or 20 years into the future. Sometimes that's guesswork, but part of the job is doing the research, figuring out what other people in similar businesses are seeing and what they think, and really trying to apply that to your organization and your thought process to help make your organization not just get through the day-to-day, but also be prepared for the future. And I will also say that at that time in my life, when I was coming out of Andrew Jackson High School in Queens, New York, in theory, I understood that once your schooling ends, you're still supposed to be learning, but you really don't understand until you get into the work world the real nature of the fact that when your formal education ends, there is a new kind of education and a lifetime of study that you have to continue that will go on throughout your career. So as mentioned, I was fortunate to be admitted into Harvard. It was actually called Radcliffe back then. Radcliffe was the women's school associated with Harvard. Harvard was the men's school. Fortunately, it is now, we've come a long way, baby, as the commercial once said, and it is now one school that equally admits both women and men. When I went there, I knew that my strengths were not necessarily in the science and math. My strengths were much more in language and history. And so I knew that I was probably going to take a career that was either in government service, probably in the law, with an eye towards the entertainment industry. That was primarily driven because both my parents were performers, and so I was heavily influenced as a young person by being around people in the entertainment industry. I started out as a history major. I decided that history, at least as the major was structured at Harvard at that time, was a little too theoretical, and so I moved and changed my major to government, which was the closest that Harvard had at that time to political science, and what I felt was going to position me best to move to law school. I had decided by the time I got to my junior or senior year in college that my direction would be one of going to law school. I applied to a number of schools. I was fortunate to get admitted into Georgetown, which is in Washington, D.C., and I really enjoyed, wanted to go to Georgetown for two reasons. One, at the time, we're talking 1978, so this was a very long time ago, the field of entertainment law was not really a well-structured field at law schools. Georgetown was one of the few schools that actually approached entertainment law, from copyright to negotiating agreements, et cetera, as a discipline. So that was one attraction. The other reason I wanted to go to Georgetown was because it was in Washington, D.C. And I knew I was going to have to work to help fund my law school education. And by being in DC, there was a lot more opportunity for me to get part-time work as a student in law firms. Yeah, they were grunt jobs at the time, but at least it was exposure to lawyers, to law firms, to sort of the real world. I actually also worked in government at the Department of Interior one summer. But it was an opportunity for me to not just learn the law in theory, but begin to get an exposure to what the real world was like. I did have, however, somewhat of a change of direction when I got to my third year in law school. For those of you who may not be familiar, law school is usually 3 years to get your degree. I realized that I really wasn't interested in working for a law firm. And given some of the political changes that were happening following the 1980 election into the new incoming administration in 1981, I really was not interested in working at one of the federal departments in Washington, D.C. either. And so I was torn as to where I would go. And I have to say, the summer that between my second and third year, I was a little dejected. I was like, oh, I've spent all this time and all my parents' money going to law school, and maybe I really don't want to be a lawyer quite the way they tell you you should be a lawyer. And I was very blessed to have a conversation with my dad. My late father was a musician, and he said to me, you know, instead of giving up and being frustrated, given your politics and given what you want to do, why don't you think about working for one of the entertainment unions, one of the unions that represents performers and other people in the entertainment industry? And I would never have thought of that, but so it was the first lesson I learned, which was of many lessons, but one of the first lessons is when you think you've hit a roadblock, talk to people who may not necessarily be in your bubble or in your field. They might have a view and a thought about opportunities and a new path that you might be able to take that you would never have thought of. And if it weren't for that conversation with my dad, I would not have ever thought of applying to AFTRA, the American Federation of Television and Radio Artists. And I was fortunate to be hired by them. And I started working at their New York local office. And it was a new experience for me in that when I was in law school, I really had not focused on labor law. So when I went to AFTRA, yes, I was working for singers and actors and news people. Those were the union members I represented and whose contracts I was negotiating. But I really had to understand that in the context of labor law. So that was a whole new field of study that I had to dive into to be able to take on a different kind of role. I was not going into court. I didn't want to be that kind of lawyer. But in order to negotiate union contracts and be able to make sure that my members' rights were protected, I had to serve in the role of a lawyer who understood what does labor law say about how you negotiate union contracts? What does labor law say about how people should be treated in the workplace? And those were all the things that I had to study in that time. It was also quite an experience in really getting out of the theoretical that you learn in school to the real. And one of the things that, because of the time in which I entered the union, which was 1981, over the next 3 to 4 years, the ways in which the laws between unions and management, which was where my role was, began to change because there had been a change in the presidential administration. There were new types of judges who were more conservative. The National Labor Relations Board, which on a day-to-day basis is the organization that deals with the relationships between unions, union members, and management, the National Labor Relations Board had new people in charge who had been appointed by a new president. And so over the course of 2 to 3 years, what I had learned in law school about how laws were interpreted had actually changed. And it was one of the first real-world experiences I had in how government really matters. including the parts of the government that most people really don't see. When I was at the bargaining table, for example, in 1981, the things that would be considered unlawful for an employer or a corporation to do, by 1984 and 1985, with changes in judges and changes in who interpreted the laws, were no longer considered unlawful. And so not only was that a learning experience of why government matters and why understanding how your work world is affected by different aspects of the government, it also became a challenge and an opportunity to learn how to do things in new ways when some of the floors that you expected to be there to cover your work and cover what you were trying to accomplish weren't quite as solid and as steady as they had been when you started out. The next step in my evolution, as I said, I started out at a pretty low level in the organization, but as time went on and as I negotiated more contracts, I moved up a little bit. But unfortunately, the opportunity for me to become, and I'll explain this in a minute, a co-executive director of the New York local of AFTRA was an unfortunate circumstance. My boss passed away suddenly. I did not want, and to this day, would not have wanted to get a promotion in that way. But when our boss passed away suddenly, the board of directors looked at me and another young woman who had come out of law school at the same time that I did, and we kind of worked together almost as two peas in a pod. The board of directors decided that even though we were at the young ages of 28 and 29, which is pretty young to be the CEO of a nonprofit organization that at that time had an operating budget of about $5 or $6 million, which in 1986 dollars was a lot of money. They decided to put me and another young woman whose name is Helene Antler to make us co-executive directors of the operation, where suddenly we found ourselves responsible for a staff of 50 people. We found ourselves responsible for an organization that was operating in what was, frankly, a hostile environment to unions. There were a lot of economic changes that were happening in the entertainment industry and the broadcasting industry at that time. So lesson number 3, I think I'm up to, that came from this, is that when you find yourself in a crisis, don't spend time realizing it's a crisis. Just spend your time figuring out what you have to do to put every foot forward and just plow through it and get through it. If I really stopped to have thought about what a tough situation we found ourselves in at the young age of 28 or 29, we probably would never have gotten done what we needed to do. That takes me to about 1987, and I'm going to speed this up, but I'm trying to get through a couple of lessons. And in 1987, I was at a meeting of the heads, the executive directors of all of the local unions within AFTRA. At that time, there were about 25 different local offices that AFTRA had. And at that meeting, the head of the San Francisco office approached me and said, I'm going to be retiring from my position as executive director. I want to focus 100% on practicing law. And I would like you to consider to come out to San Francisco and head up the union office in San Francisco. That was lesson number 4, I think I'm at, because you never know who is watching what you're doing. And if you're working hard, if you're doing your homework, if you are speaking when you have something really important to say, people you never realize are noticing you will be noticing you. And so they flew me out to San Francisco. I wanted to take that opportunity. They flew me out. I actually met with their board of directors. I had a 36-hour whirlwind tour of San Francisco, and I flew back to New York, and I said, I'm happy to accept the job. So that took me to San Francisco, and I would say probably some of the most transformative lessons and experiences that I had happened at that particular time in that particular place in my life. And I think we're now up to fifth lesson. The fifth lesson is when I was in San Francisco as the head of the San Francisco office. I had many of the same responsibilities. I was negotiating contracts. I was beginning to negotiate some contracts in new fields that I hadn't been involved in before. So for example, at that time, nobody had ever heard of video games, which are common now, but the technology was just developing. And we had to figure out how to negotiate a contract for the performers, the voiceover guys and the announcers who were working in video contracts. So it was a whole new way of study, a whole new way of learning about a completely new technology in a new industry and how to apply that to the people we were representing. But probably the most transformative piece and a lesson that I needed to carry if I was ever going to move forward into a position like the one I had now is that mentors matter. Having someone who can mentor you, who you can go to for feedback, really, really can make a difference. And the positive lessons that you learn from those mentors are important ones to carry within you so that when you get to a position that you are responsible for mentoring others, you can impart those those lessons forward. And I would like to just give you a sense of the three people who I look at in my time in San Francisco at a very transformative time in my life were mentors and what each of them brought to me. Don Taylor was, may he rest in peace, the attorney for the San Francisco office. He was the one who actually approached me and said, I want to retire from being the executive director and become an attorney. He's a very sharp attorney, always did his homework. I was impressed to watch how he did his homework. And he was tough as a negotiator when I would sit at the table with him and watch how he negotiated with the other side, but he always did it with humor. And one of the things I've learned is that you can be tough and you can sometimes have to deliver a message that isn't necessarily one that the other person wants to hear. But if you maintain your humor and you do it with grace, people can hear hard messages that otherwise won't get absorbed. The second person who was an influence was a newscaster by the name of Bill Hillman. Incredible man. And one of the things I learned from him is that it is important to take your time with other people and listen carefully. And when you are in a group or you are in a meeting, after you've listened, to when you speak, to make sure that your words really matter. Bill Hillman was the kind of person who, when he stood up, the entire room would get quiet and turn to hear what he had to say, because he kept his cool, he kept his counsel, but when it was time to say something, people went, if he is speaking, he has something that is important that I need to learn. The third person is a woman by the name of Belva Davis. She is a retired newswoman. She was the first African-American woman to serve as a television reporter on the West Coast. She has 8 Emmys to her name. She is incredible in a number of different ways. She has an incredible autobiography. If you ever have a chance to read it, it's called Never in My Wildest Dreams, A Black Woman's Life in Journalism. And what I learned from her is that integrity in everything you do really matters. Even when it's not popular and even when it can be uncomfortable, maintaining integrity and acting with integrity and carrying yourself with dignity is really critical. And you would be so surprised, again, how many people you can win over to your side when they understand that you are coming from a place of integrity and you treat them and carry yourself with dignity. So those were probably the most important lessons I learned during that time in my life. And I hope that as I've tried to mentor people in my current life, that hopefully it's been helpful and I've been able to pass that on. Just real quickly, in 1991, actually, I was asked by the National Office of the Union to come back to New York and to head up a new department in the national office that I would create for the National Union. And again, that's part of the message of you never know who's watching you, and seeing what you're doing when you do your homework. I had to really do more study because technology was changing. Regulations that govern the entertainment and news industries were changing, and the economy during that time was going through transition, and a lot of companies that we had relationships with were going bankrupt. So I had to learn a lot. I had to learn about FCC regulations that I never had to study before. I had to learn about bankruptcy law and how that affected people's pension benefits and health benefits and what to do in those cases. And again, it's part of that story that you never finish studying, no matter how well your education was through high school, college, and graduate school. I decided in 1998, because I had been working with AFTRA for a number of years, I turned 40 in 1997 actually. I decided that in 1997, that come 1998, I would take a year off from work. The economy was getting a little bit better. I was in a position when I could do that. And I decided to take a 6 months to a year off from work. But before I could do that, I actually got a call from Harvard University to come work for them as their head of labor and employee relations. Which was interesting because now I would be on the management side for the university instead of the union side, which had always been where my career was. The good news was that I was able to bring two things. First of all, representing university management, I was able to bring what I had learned representing the union side and the employee side to help management be a better manager. I also learned that even though it was a university, there were a lot of similarities in how it operated that the union structure had. And so an important part of how you move along is to figure out what are the similarities in my new environment that existed in my old environment that I can carry forward and be productive. But the other thing that was important in that role was in an environment like Harvard, someone like myself, it can very often be, and it's important to always remember, when you are the pioneer, when you are the first one to break through a given ceiling. As an African-American woman, from Queens, New York, to be in a room with people who are discussing issues and making decisions about the future of the university. It's very important to remember not only who you are and how you have to conduct yourself, because you are serving as very often the first ambassador of your community, but also to remember that in those rooms, you have somewhat of an obligation to bring your voice forward, to speak for those who don't have a voice in a room. And let me just give you an example of an issue that came up. At the university at that time, there was a big debate going on over providing a quote unquote living wage to workers at the university, the service workers and the janitorial staff and the maintenance staff. And there was this big debate going on in the room about, you know, and forget the numbers, but I'll use the numbers as I recall them. Should people be getting $8 an hour, or can we bring them up to $8.10 an hour, $8.15 an hour? And I had to be the one in the room who said to folks, it's important that the university raise the wages of these employees, but people don't go into these jobs to stay in these jobs. And it's equally important for us as a university, if we're going to spend money, we should not only raise people's wages, but we should create a program in the organization to help educate people so that they will have some of the skills where they can go into higher paying jobs. Many of the people that we were talking about had language barriers, and they needed the university to provide opportunities for language education, skills education. Some of them actually needed reading education. And so it was important for someone like me in the room to be able to speak to folks, speak on behalf of folks to say, this isn't just about giving them an extra 10 cents or 15 cents on their wages, although they needed more money, but it's also about how do you give people a pathway to move along in life, which nobody else in the room was really thinking about. So I'm going to stop there because I really want to leave time for the questions. After I left Harvard, I decided to go back to New York for family reasons. I had a brief time working at what used to be called Victim Services, which is now called Safe Horizon, which is a nonprofit organization that supports crime victims, including maintaining shelters, hidden shelters throughout New York City for women and families who are suffering from domestic abuse. I was not there long, but I was there long enough to again have reinforced that when you have the opportunity, it's important to speak for those who often do not have an opportunity to speak for themselves. I got an offer from AFTRA National to come back to AFTRIS, and when they found out I was living back in New York, they said, would you come back to AFTRA, which I did. And during my time, I started out as the Associate National Executive Director. There came a time when the executive director, my boss, was leaving, and the board of directors came to me and said, would you take over as the national executive director for the union? I have to admit it was a big job to want to take over, but I also recognized that this was an opportunity I had an obligation not to shy away from, because I would be the first African-American woman to serve as the national executive director of a major entertainment industry union. And I felt a responsibility, not just the confidence that, yeah, I could probably ultimately do the job with continued study and doing my homework and recognizing that I was going to have to double down, but I also felt an obligation that there was a glass ceiling I had an opportunity to break through. And I needed to break through that glass ceiling for all of the women and people of color who would be coming behind me one day. I'm glad I did it. So after leaving AFTRA in 2012, I ended up here at the Film Musicians Secondary Markets Fund again. You never know who is watching you, because I was approached to come and take over this organization as their executive director. I'm not going to say I have all my lessons from this role down yet, but I will say it is very new. There are things about this job that are very similar to what I had been doing before, but there are other things here that are quite new. And so I had a learning curve, and I had to be willing, even though I had been around and had fancy titles before, to acknowledge there were still things I needed to learn, and to be open with my team that there are things they can teach me, and there are things I can teach them. And together, we will accomplish what an entire organization, not just a CEO, is responsible for, which is making sure the organization is accomplishing its mission effectively and on behalf of the people it represents, and figuring out how we're going to move forward in a world that actually is not just changing, but changing very, very rapidly. So that's my story. Those are the lessons that I learned. And I want to give a lot of time, give some time for the questions that you all may have and that might be helpful, and how my path might provide you with some thoughts about as you move forward on your path, or people, your family and friends who are on their path, and maybe tips that you can give them. So there you go. I'm open to your questions, and thank you very much. So Rosie, I don't know if you're going to moderate the questions or how we'll do it, but I will roll with the punches, however you'd like to do it.
All right. Thank you so much for your presentation, by the way. But for anyone who has a question, feel free to unmute yourselves and ask him directly, or if you're not comfortable, you can type it into the chat box.
Yeah, I gotta find the where the
I have a question. Wow, Kim, I thought I knew you, and that was really interesting. The lessons learned, I think, was really powerful. And I have a question. As a young executive, how did you find your voice and manage dealing with people that maybe had either less integrity or put you down as a female and or a minority? How did you gracefully get through those challenging moments?
It was difficult, and because there were really three, if you will, three challenges. One being a woman in 1981 or 1982 in an environment, a union environment where most of the executives were men. Certainly being a woman of color, because there were very few, if any, who were on the track I was on. But the other issue that was a challenge was my youth. A lot of the newscasters, particularly, because a lot of my work was with the disc jockeys and announcers and newscasters, you know, these were people who, many of whom were old enough to be my parents at the time. And, you know, there were days when they made you feel like, okay, here comes junior achievement to negotiations. And these were people who were looking at a 27 or 28-year-old who's responsible for negotiating a complicated labor contract that affects their salaries, their benefits. The way to deal with it was, you know, and I can't say at that time I had a great thought process. I really think about it in retrospect, was number one, to do my homework. Always be my biggest self-critic in questioning my assumptions. I always question my assumptions. I recognized, and this was something particularly for women and minorities who came along in my era, that we had to work twice as hard or 10 times as hard to be considered good, to be really honest with people. And there were times when you would get a question and you didn't know the answer to it. And you don't make it up. You honestly say to people, you know what, this is a new question for me. I need to go back. I need to do some research, and I will get back to you, and make sure that you get back to them, you know, when you do that. And over time, people began to understand that you knew your stuff and you worked hard, and they understood that you had interests at heart. And when people see that, they will put trust in you. The one other point I will make is it was not easy. There were times when you'd sit in a room and, you know, you'd be in a meeting and you'd say, well, 2 + 2 = 4. And the men in the room would have to turn to another man and say, does 2 + 2 really equal 4? And you can lose your temper and lose your cool over it. And one of the first things you learn is when to pick your battles and how to pick your battles. And if you're reacting, you know, and let's face it, as women, people were expecting us to react emotionally to offenses or slights. And if you do that every time, then at a certain point, people become inured to it. But if you pick your battles, and when it's time for you to really make a stand, and you've, you know, handled yourself with dignity and integrity up to that point, and you kind of really set people back on their heels, they get set back on their heels. And and they sort of understand, well, A, I'm not going to make that mistake again. And they understand, B, that you are not someone to be trifled with. And the fact that you may seem calm and quiet. I had someone once dub me, someone who's a very good friend, by the way, who watched me in negotiations, once dubbed me the Ice Princess, because I would just sit there with you know, no emotion on my face. And this person is a really good friend. You know, you realize that when people see that you're calm and methodical all the time, that when you kind of, you know, explode, they really do sit back and they understand, well, maybe I was wrong, and maybe I need to not assume that because she's quiet and thinks before she speaks, that she's a wallflower. So that's kind of how I got through it. So any other questions? Okay.
To kind of piggyback off of Leslie's question, how do you deal with fear? I'm sure that there are many, many times where you were unsure, or something you said many times where something was new and you're coming in. How did you deal with fear? Because oftentimes fear is the biggest thing that holds us back. So what do you do when you're naturally afraid about, you know, the path that you're taking, or, you know, something new that's happening?
Well, it's a different kind of fears about different kind of things. You know, if your fear is, I don't want to let somebody else down, or I want to make sure that if I have someone's future or finances or health and welfare benefits in my hand, you focus more on what do I need to do right by my mission on behalf of that person. And by taking it out of yourself and putting it into how do I take care of somebody else, and I protect somebody else, or I elevate somebody else, that fear that we have that is usually associated with fear for ourselves kind of gets compartmentalized somewhere else. The other piece is sometimes you have to find time, you know, you've got to maintain the stoic soldier mode in public. You've got to give yourself time to go back to someone you can trust, a family member, your best friend from grade school, or, you know, go out in the woods and talk to your dog. You know, that you can kind of let loose and give yourself time to say, okay, this was scary. I've gotten through this day and I've gotten through the next day. It's going to be scary tomorrow, but now that I know I got through this day and the day before, maybe I have a pretty good chance of getting through tomorrow. So it's a combination of externalizing what your intent and your mission is, as well as giving yourself the time and the space privately when you need to kind of let it all hang out, to be able to do that so that the folks you need to interact with professionally never see you sweat, as the commercial used to go. So I hope that's helpful, and if that makes some sense. Okay, good. Any other questions? No, my life is sort of a weird one. Go ahead, Rosie.
I know your bio mentioned how you serve as a current board member for a Film LA. I was just wondering if maybe you could talk about that a little bit as well.
Oh, thank you. That's really a good question, because that is another important part as you grow professionally, is finding opportunities outside of your job to be in organizations like serve on a board or serve on a committee. And by the way, what you got in my bio was actually a very short list of all of the various places where I've been either a delegate or a board member or a committee member. And those roles are really quite good. They tend to be volunteer, so you have to find time to do it outside of your day job. It is an opportunity, frankly, to learn about how to interact with people in a professional way without it actually being, you're kind of learning without it necessarily being the job that your day-to-day job hinges on. It's also a great way to have exposure to people who may have a common interest with you, but who come from very, very different backgrounds. So when I lived in Boston, when I was at Cambridge, actually, when I was in Boston at Harvard, I got appointed because my roommate from college happened to work for the governor of Massachusetts. I got appointed to what was called the African American Advisory Council, which was a council created by the governor of Massachusetts to address a number of issues affecting the African American community in Massachusetts, particularly in Boston, which is the biggest city there. So everybody on that council and on that board had an interest in the education in the African American community. How do we deal with business, entrepreneurship in the African American community, a whole lot of other issues. But these were all people from completely different industries and completely different backgrounds. And it gave me an exposure to people in healthcare that I did not have, to people in academia. This was before, I was working as thinking it was different than my role in labor for academia, but really dealing with people who were thinking about academia from a very different perspective. Serving on a board, you have a different kind of role. In your role in the board generally is about trying to set the direction of the organization, but also respecting the fact that the staff and the employees of the organization are the ones who actually need to move forward the policy directives. So when you serve on a board, you need to think of yourself like Congress. You help pass the laws, but you need to be willing to let the staff of the organization serve like the executive branch. They're the ones that actually execute the laws. And that's a real learning process, because if you're somebody who's used to being in the executive branch, trying to put in your head to respect the executive branch's role and keep yourself in what I'm going to call the legislative branch of an organization is somewhat of a good learning experience, and actually helps you when you're dealing with your own board of directors. Once you've served as a member of the board of directors, when you go back to your day job and you have to report to a board of directors, it actually helps you know how to deal with your board of directors. So I hope that answers your question, Rosie.
It does. There was another question into the chat box, if you can access it. If not, I can read it out loud, whichever you prefer.
I see it. Thank you, Kim, for saying you soon. My question is, what is the one thing you wish you knew about law school that you learned about afterwards? Well, I could be a little flip and say, I wish that before I took tax one, I decided not to take tax one, and I would just let my accountant handle my taxes for the rest of my life. One of the things that I knew that I wish I knew about law school, that I learned about afterwards, really goes back to the beginning of my story. When I went to law school, there were sort of these tracks that, particularly at Georgetown, there were these two tracks that people were pigeonholed into. One was you were going to go to a law firm in private practice, or you were going to go work for government, because it was DC, and a lot of people ended up in government. And maybe you didn't work at government in DC, but you went back home and worked in state government or whatever. I think that had I gone into law school knowing that there were these other kinds of opportunities like the one I ended up with, where I've never gone into court as a litigator. I've been in court a lot as a witness, but that there was a role for me to take my law school education, what you learn from law. You know, I can't remember any of the statutes I studied back in 1978 or 1979, and they're probably all outdated anyway. But what law school really teaches you is how to think, how to analyze, a certain degree of discipline on how you have to study, because your first year in law school is tough, but you learn a new way of studying. I think that had I known going into law school that there were the kind of opportunities that I ended up actually having, I might have actually taken some different law school classes, just to get a little bit more substantive knowledge. I probably would have taken a couple of more labor law classes. I might have taken some education about the management of nonprofit organizations and what does fiduciary responsibility in a nonprofit organization actually mean. I think if I had known in 1978 what I realized by 1981, 1982, I probably would have taken some different courses, but I am very grateful I went to Georgetown. It was probably one of the most real world law schools that you could have gone to at that time. It was not sort of the Ivy Tower, and with all due respect to the Ivy League, it was not sort of the Ivy Tower, Harvard Law School, Columbia Law School, Yale Law School. The professors we had were attorneys who were practicing in DC. Many of them came out of government. One of the most impressive classes I had was a criminal law class where the criminal law professor was Samuel Dash. I would encourage you to Google Samuel Dash and Watergate and find out who he is. So having the exposure to those kinds of practicing attorneys who were in the Washington, D.C. milieu, I'm very, very grateful that I got a chance to go to Georgetown. The other thing that was really cool about Georgetown is that it had each class, the class of 79 or 81, each class had 3 sections where we were divided up into 3 groups, plus a 4th section, which was the night school. We actually interacted with a lot of those night school students who were people who were out in the work world. They were older students who were coming back and getting their law degree, and the opportunity to interact and intermix with them at that time. Now, maybe other law schools have a lot of them have it now. At Georgetown, that was pretty unique at the time. And it was really good to kind of give you a real grounding on the real world, and a grounding to see people who had day jobs, had families they needed to take care of, but were still going to a nationally recognized law school and getting their law degree. And they certainly were role models for people like me. I don't know if I quite went in the direction you were asking, but hopefully that hopefully that was Arasaya. I hope I pronounced that. I hope I pronounced it close to right. I hope that answered your question. So
Araxia, thank you so much. It did.
yes, sorry, thank you. Any other questions?
I have another question.
Sure.
Did you purposefully enter and stay in nonprofit? And if so, why?
Interesting question. I purposely went into the union because of what I told you about the story, my dad kind of opening up my eyes to something I didn't see. Once I got into the union, and to be clear, I was with AFTRA from 1981 until I went to Harvard in 1998. That was 18 years, 17 years working in different roles, as I've talked about, in the union. So I would say during those 17 years, I was probably more directed about my loyalty and my belief in and my kind of commitment to what AFTRA was doing as a union. But when I decided to take time off and Harvard came knocking and said, hi, would you like to come work with us? I found it interesting because I did have somewhat of a realization at that point when I was looking for where was I going to go after AFTRA, that actually I really did want to be in a nonprofit. I was more motivated by, and there's nothing wrong with it, but it's about what motivates me. I was more motivated by being able to look in the mirror in the morning. I called it the look in the mirror test. If I could look in the mirror in the morning and say, what I am doing is about making a difference in the lives of people, and that I wasn't having to cater to, as I might in a law firm, how many billable hours I was racking up, and I didn't have to cater to how much profit is the company making and how much are the shareholders getting in their stock buybacks. That all I could focus on is what I'm doing making somebody's life better? Or if I can't, particularly working union side could be really tough. Even if I'm not making their life better, I'm at least preventing their life from getting worse. All of that that was kind of what was inside of me. And so that probably, I would say around that time period where I had to think about, okay, it's 1997, you've turned 40 years old, you're going to take time off because you want to see where the rest of your life is going to be. I realized that where I was going to go was either going to be a nonprofit, another union, academia, where you really are working for a higher purpose, was just kind of what I was about. And it doesn't mean what anybody else is motivated by is wrong. It just means what works for me. So.
And just for those of us that have not worked in nonprofit, what have you seen as the difference in nonprofit versus government work versus private industry?
Okay. Private industry, one of the challenges in private industry is that, you are ultimately very driven by the bottom line. It very often, for most private industry, it is ultimately at the end of the day, the decisions are about money. How much revenue are we making? How much revenue are we making? How much profit are we making? And how do we juggle our expenses? And very often expenses are really people, to make sure that we are keeping our expenses as low as possible. Nonprofits, so that's kind of what the motivator is. Nonprofits and government are very similar in certain respects, in the sense that it's not definitely expenses can be an issue, but you don't necessarily have, it's not really a profit motive per se, and there are no shareholders that you have to work through. The other similarity is that you do have stakeholders. You know, the stakeholders in government are very often the public or whatever constituency it is that you're serving, depending upon what your role is in government. In a nonprofit, you have stakeholders who are either your membership in the case of the union, or grantees in the case of organizations that give out grants and charities, or, you know, if you're a nonprofit that, you know, is in the environment or taking care of wildlife, you know, a different kind of constituency. I do think that government tends to have one of the challenges of government that you don't necessarily see in nonprofit, is that government has a lot of different bureaucratic layers that, I know, I say the obvious. Government has a lot of bureaucratic layers that come from a whole lot of laws and regulations that build up over time. Many and most of those laws are very legitimate and were put in place for very good reason, but sometimes when it's 2020 and you're dealing with regulations that have built up since 1950, it can get a little bit unwieldy. Nonprofits do have their own set of regulations that, you know, can be challenging to get through, but they're nowhere near as complex or as layered as government is. Every organization, whether it's a nonprofit, whether it's a business, or whether it's government, there's also one thing that's true, whether it's academia or whatever, one thing that's true is there's a certain degree of politics that are involved in all of them. And one of the keys to success is understanding how to navigate politics without becoming political yourself. If you become political yourself, at some point, the side you're on is going to be on the downside, even if it's on the upside at another point. But if you can manage the politics without necessarily becoming political, and I can't tell you there's a formula for that. It's not something you can study. You just kind of learn it through sometimes making mistakes and watching other people's mistakes. That is a truism through any workplace that anybody is going to be in, and is going to be a necessary skill for any advancement and success in any organization. I don't care where you go. So, but it's a good question, so thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Anything else? Are there any chats I should be looking for? Okay, I'm good.
So seeing that there are no more questions and our time is almost up, I would just like to take a moment to thank you and thank all of our attendees for being here. And at least just speaking for myself, I think you mentioned a lot of very interesting lessons, let alone your story. So I do thank you for sharing that with us. I'm personally inspired, and I'm sure everyone else is too. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say. Just for our attendees, I will say that there will be a survey that goes around, so please take the time to fill that out and join us every Friday. But thank you everyone for being here, and thank you, Kim, too, especially.
Well, thank you. It was a great experience, and you raised great questions and made me think about some things I haven't thought about in a while. So I hope that a couple of the lessons might be of use to you as you move forward in your lives and your careers. And again, I really appreciate the time and the opportunity. And thank you, Leslie, for helping to move that along. And it was good to see you.